Good evening and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. I'm Margot Stage, host and producer of a public affairs show called Arts and Ideas on WGBH Radio. And WGBH is delighted to be here with the Ford Hall Forum, co-sponsoring this new mini-series called WGBH In Person. We're kicking it off tonight with 3 regular panelists on PBS's Washington Week in Review. And they'll be giving us a preview and their views of the 1992 presidential campaign. Next spring, WGBH In Person will continue featuring other guests from public radio and TV here on the Ford Hall Forum. Tonight's presentation by our panelists will be followed by a question and answer session. And as you can see, there's a microphone right here in the center of the hall. Forum. Finally, before I introduce our guests, the next Ford Hall Forum will take a look at the tragedy of childhood hunger in America with Congressman Michael Espy, Robert Greenstein of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, and J. Larry Brown of the Tufts Nutrition Center. So that's the next Ford Hall Forum next Sunday, November 17th at 7 p.m. at Northeastern's Blackman Auditorium. So now on with the show. I'm very honored to introduce tonight's guests, who all appear regularly on the public TV program Washington Week in Review. And again, they join us tonight for a preview of the 1992 presidential campaign. Jack Nelson is the Washington Bureau Chief of the Los Angeles Times. And he has held that post since 1975. He was up in our neck of the woods as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and has co-authored several books, including Beyond Reagan, The Politics of Upheaval. Julie Johnson. Julie is the Supreme Court and Legal Affairs correspondent for Time magazine. She previously covered presidential politics and domestic affairs for the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, and the Orlando Sentinel. Ms. Johnson is currently pursuing a law degree at Georgetown University. And Charles McDowell. Charlie is a syndicated columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch who has covered all the national political conventions since 1952. He has written 3 books, several PBS documentaries, and was the voice of Confederate Private Sam Watkins in Ken Burns's The Civil War. And our moderator tonight is Marty Linsky. At the end. And Marty is now a lecturer in public policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government after years of active duty in both politics and media, as executive director of The Advocates at WGBH-TV, editor of The Real Paper in Cambridge, and a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Marty Linsky also has a baseball card collection totaling more than 25,000 cards. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Marty now.
Thank you, Margot. My job tonight is to make sure that I don't get in the way of a good conversation, and we ought to have a good conversation as we get into yet another political and election season. As we were sitting downstairs, one of our panelists turned to another of our panelists and said, "Are you going to be upbeat tonight?" And the response was, "As upbeat as you can be about the cynical use of race and gender." That is a tough note in which to start this conversation, but it is the note in which we do start this conversation, and I look forward not only to this evening tonight, but to the public dialogue which will take place over the next year, of which this is an important part. So I thank you all for coming. We begin tonight with Jack Nelson.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here to speak at the Ford Hall Forum. Listening to Charlie McDowell be interviewed as somebody who's covered conventions since 1952 reminded me that last night I was introduced as somebody who became a reporter when Harry Truman was president, and that's true. But I hasten to add after my introduction that I was a teenage reporter. But you know, I've been on Washington Week in Review really since the Watergate days, and every now and then, of course, people who watch that program regularly, they'll recognize you somewhere. And I was at a place called Coleman's in Washington having lunch one Saturday, and an elderly guy was sitting at the bar next to me, and he turned and looked at me. There were two guys sitting there actually, and he says, ain't you that fellow Nelson of the LA Times? And I said, yeah. He said, yeah, I thought so. I see you on Washington Week in Review. And the other guy says, got yourself a fan there. He said, I didn't say I was a fan. But you know, I'm basically a print reporter. I'm not a television reporter. I'm basically a print reporter. And I have trouble smiling on cue. And my wife was in television, and she used to tell me you always ought to smile when you're introduced. And I said, it's very difficult. I can't smile on cue. She said, no, it's not natural. She said, well, it's not natural for you to not smile. Anyway, it became a matter of discussion even on Washington Week in Review, and people wrote in. And some people said I didn't smile, and others said I did, and some said that they defended my right not to smile. And one guy from Boston wrote in, and he said, Nelson smiles just enough considering he covers the White House, which I do. But you know, I mentioned that last night I was introduced. I was speaking to the Council on Competitiveness, which is a nonpartisan group of business and academic leaders, and they wanted to discuss competitiveness as a political issue in the 1992 campaign. And the problem is that it's a lot like writing about competitiveness as a news story. It's kind of like dealing with a budget. Neither word has a very sexy ring to it. So candidates and journalists alike are bedeviled by this same problem of dealing with those kind of issues, and it's how do you get people's attention? And I think maybe you get people's attention on things like that by straight talk. Straight talk about the economy to help people understand how all of the economic and social problems under the umbrella issue of competitiveness affect their standard of living or their quality of life. And as you know, straight talk has been in short supply in Washington recently. It was George Will who said that his friend Ronald Reagan's feel-good talk was like a narcotic to Americans, blinding them to the hazards just over the horizon. In face of all of the negative news that we've had and the polls of discontent about the economy, President Bush still insists that there's no big problem. He says it's just the Democrats trying to make political hay. And he advises people to go out and buy homes. Well, he should have heard some of the Republicans I talked with last night. Pete Peterson, the former Commerce Secretary, he told me the press hasn't even begun to convey to the American people the real extent of our economic problems. He and other Republicans say that without a dramatic change in course, that our crushing national debt threatens the economic disaster and not too far down the road. I bring a heavy, rather gloomy message tonight because I agree with Pete Peterson. Somehow, I think we've failed to convey the extent of the problem and the acute need to do something about it. After 11 years of ruling the White House, the Republicans can no longer blame the economic mess on Jimmy Carter. But the Democrats are in such disarray that they hardly know which way to turn, and they've also failed to provide leadership. With few exceptions, they've also failed to engage in straight talk. In 1988, Michael Dukakis tried to articulate competitiveness, but he didn't talk straight. He said he had read too many stories about how America was supposed to be in decline. Dukakis said he didn't buy that. But we are in decline. And those hazards that George Will talked about are closer than ever. For some reason, though, neither journalists nor politicians have been able to drive the message home. We've talked a lot about that at the LA Times, where I work. We're trying to get a better handle on it and to do a better job of relating all of these economic issues to individual voters. Well, Washington doesn't have a handle on it yet, and I'm not sure they're trying, because from the White House to the Congress, the government is engaged in a retreat from leadership on economic and other domestic issues. The President and Congress both have sidestepped an array of these problems that shadow the nation's future. And they will, I think, be the major political issues of the 1992 campaign. But you look at the economy, at education and the environment, at health care and poverty, the deteriorating infrastructure of roads, bridges, and basic facilities. Washington repeatedly minimizes the magnitude of these problems and settles for partial responses instead of seeking long-term action. Now, I was born during the Depression, Not in 4 decades as a reporter have I heard such dire predictions about the economy and the general state of the nation that I'm hearing now. Ross Perot summarizes our problems better than anyone in Washington. Some time ago he summed them up as succinctly as anyone I've heard. He said in 10 years earlier we'd been the world's largest creditor nation, but had become the world's largest debtor nation, that we're the most crime-ridden, drug-infested, violent nation of the industrialized world, that we have 5% of the world's population and use 50% of its cocaine. And while Perot said 9 of the 10 largest banks in the world were Japanese and the 10th was an American bank that would be bankrupt if you discounted third world loans, now he simply says there's not an American bank among the world's top 20, most of which are Japanese or German. We used to be the number one in almost everything that counted. But now we're getting so used to being second or third or lower that we've started lowering our standards. It reminds me of something my wife's grandmother used to say. She said you can get used to anything, even hanging, if you do it long enough. But now you take the environment. I've always wondered why younger people haven't held older people responsible for the dramatic deterioration in the environment. Maybe it's because they're used to the lower standards we've set. Most of my generation grew up with relatively clean air and streams and beaches. Today's young people simply haven't had that experience. I grew up in Biloxi on the Mississippi coast, and I can tell you we never had a beach closed because of pollution. We never saw any syringes on the beach. In fact, beach closings anywhere used to be rare, and now they're commonplace. Throughout the nation this past summer, there were 1,400 instances of beach closings or swimmers being warned to stay away from beaches because of pollution. There were 338 beach closings in California alone, 228 in New Jersey, 218 in Connecticut. And the states with the most closings weren't necessarily the ones with the most polluted beaches, because states have different standards for closing beaches. As Donella Meadows, a professor of environmental studies at Dartmouth College, points out, there's now a suggestion we set up national standards for beach closure. In other words, instead of cleaning up the beaches, we standardize the definition of pollution. And of course, if too many beaches are closed, we can simply lower the standards. She calls it a case of national drift to low performance, and correctly sees a pattern to that drift. It's certainly true of commercial television, of public schools, of our infrastructures, as well as the environment. We become inured to our problems. Standards are set and then lowered, and poor performance that once made us cringe becomes defined as normal. Take the federal budget, which Ronald Reagan pledged to balance during his first term. I remember when we all shuddered at the thought of $100 billion deficits. Then we recoiled in disbelief at the thought of $200 billion deficits as far as the eye can see, as the economists say. Now we talk about the deficit hitting $365 billion, and there's hardly any outcry. Jimmy Carter worried about being the first president with $1 trillion national debt. Ross Perot was in our bureau for a breakfast session about a month ago, and he warned that if we continue on our present course, our total debt will go from the $3.5 trillion now to $12 or $13 trillion by the turn of the century, only 9 years away. And Perot says that will wreck us. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. Study third world countries that have gotten us into the high inflation and that sort of thing. You realize you just can't do that, but that's what we're doing. I told Joe Albritton, the banker and developer, what Perot had said, and he agreed it would wreck us, but he said the present debt is higher than he says. I've had the numbers run, and if you talk about declared and undeclared debt, the present is, debt is $7 trillion. Some businessmen and politicians talk not only of double dip recession, but a depression. Ted Turner of CNN says we're in a serious recession, and the way we're going, we'll have a depression. Congressman Richard Gephardt says the refusal of Japan and Germany to finance our debt could push us into a depression. And others warn that our continuing heavy emphasis on military power and neglect of pressing domestic problems means we're in danger of becoming like the Soviet Union before its breakup, a crippled superpower with vast armed forces but a deteriorating economy. Edward Luttwak, a scholar with the Center for Strategic and International Affairs, calls us a nation of weak banks, capital-starved industries, ill-equipped to compete in the new geo-economic era with nations with capital power but not the firepower we have. And he argues that only a vast national effort will suffice to re-equip the U.S. for the new era. But first, the barrier of complacency must be breached, and breaching that barrier poses a major problem for Washington. It's become commonplace in the capital city to pretend that economically nothing is much amiss, or if it is, nothing can be done about it. Among Washington politicians, it's now accepted fact that neither Democrats nor Republicans can demonstrate leadership to tackle the most critical domestic problems. And why not? Because the government is broke. I had a senior Bush administration policymaker tell me he thought the Bush presidency was a little like the Jimmy Carter presidency when Carter declared that the country was suffering from a crisis of confidence. Carter said progress was being stymied by lack of spirit, which others labeled a malaise. The word malaise has stuck to Jimmy Carter like flypaper, although he never uttered the word. But the point is that malaise came to signify a crisis of confidence on the part of the public. Now, I had a government official tell me, a Bush administration official, that it's the malaise business that Carter spoke about, but this time it's on the government side, not the public's. And there are more similarities between the Bush and Carter administration than you would think. They both appear to think this leadership thing is overrated, and they believe in fixing problems, resolving matters, but no big themes. Congress, of course, shares a substantial measure of responsibility, but the primary burden of leadership and initiative in the federal government rests with the President. Far more than any member of Congress, the President can command the nation's attention using his office as a bully pulpit. In no way can Congress match the President's resources for developing programs and stimulating public debate. And this is particularly true now with both houses of Congress and solidly in the Democratic field. Well, we're into an election campaign now that will determine whether Bush will be reelected or the voters will turn to a little-known Democratic nominee. Because Jesse Jackson isn't running and Mario Cuomo is not decided yet, but he may decide very soon. But there's a chance, I think, that one of these Democratic contenders will really catch fire and not only win the nomination, but set the stage for a serious national debate. I think it's an outside chance, though, because the most damaging drift to low performance in this country is in our politics. And as Professor Meadows said, that's really why we're seeing the drift to lower performance in so many other places. We've come to expect campaigns in this country to be negative and mean-spirited and based on know-nothing sound bites. We've got a president who's been extraordinarily popular, but at the same time exceptionally partisan and polarizing. I've covered George Bush off and on since he was chairman of the Republican Party during Watergate. He's a practical politician who does whatever he thinks it takes to accomplish his political goals, and his political goal now is to be reelected. When he was Republican Party chairman, he defended Richard Nixon to the bitter end until Nixon resigned in disgrace rather than be impeached. When George Bush took over as director of an embattled CIA, he immediately identified as a CIA agent. During the Reagan presidency, he was not just a loyal vice president, he was subservient. Once I interviewed him for 30 minutes when he was vice president. I used a tape recorder. When I got through, I turned to him and I said, "Mr. Vice President, you didn't tell me a thing I could use for a story." He smiled and said, "I didn't intend to." Then after he became president, early in his presidency, he invited me and several other reporters over to the White House for a luncheon interview. I reminded him of the interview I'd had with him when he was vice president. And when I got to the part about using the tape recorder and at the end of the interview telling him that he hadn't said anything that I could use for a story, he laughed and said, "Yeah, and look where I am now." Well, President Bush will do what he thinks it takes, I think, to get reelected. If it takes sound bites and Willie Horton ads, I think that's what we'll have in this campaign. But the President and his advisors are careful readers of the polls, too. And with the American people saying by an overwhelming margin, 83 to 15% in a recent Times Mirror poll, they want the presidential candidates to discuss domestic rather than foreign issues, he may actually seriously address the economy and other domestic issues. There's no question but that Americans are looking inward to their own problems these days. Their interest in foreign affairs is extremely limited. The Times Mirror poll released this week showed that keeping Saddam Hussein from getting the H-bomb was given the highest priority among foreign affairs, but it drew support from only 5% of those polled. Aid to the Soviets instead of one dominated by sound bites and Willie Horton ads. Chances for that kind of campaign, I think, too, were strengthened today by an announcement in Washington that 7 commercial and public television networks are going to televise debates among the Democratic candidates. This, I think, will give the Democratic candidates an opportunity to define themselves instead of having themselves defined by the Roger Ailes ads of the Bush campaign. These debates will focus on serious national issues rather than on the single issues and the sort of special interest issues that often dominated the primary campaigns in 1988. And that almost certainly means that in the general election we could expect serious issues to be addressed. So to me that would be good for the country no matter who gets elected. And I think I'll end now and turn it over to Julie Johnson for the upbeat message of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight, speaking to you all and being a guest of the Ford Hall Forum. But first I want to say that whenever I'm with my Washington Week pals here, and both of these guys are like some of my favorite ones to be on the show with, they always talk about, well, in 1952, when I covered something like that, you know, 1952, of course, I wasn't born. The last time I was on this show with Jack and Haynes and Rick Smith, I think, they were saying, well, you know, when Nixon went to China in 1972, well, not a high school, it's like, you know, but I feel very honored to be with them because they always give me something to look forward to. So speaking of straight talk in Washington, I wanted to pick up on that theme that Jack talked about a few moments ago, and I think it's particularly in short supply in Washington right about now. And I want to give you a little excerpt from something that appeared in the Washington Post, and we'll talk about it. But first, I also wanted to say that talking about the '92 campaign is sort of a refreshing break for me from what I've been doing for the past 2 or 3 months, which is covering the neophyte justice on the Supreme Court. Most recently, as many of you may have seen, he is the cover boy on People magazine, and it's had the court a titter with whispers, and did you see it, and did you see how his wife said, well, he doesn't owe these liberal interest groups anything. And so when I was up at the court all week, it was like dog-eared copies of People magazine, which is part of my corporate family, are all over the place. Finally, a person said to me, well, I guess this means, since he's come out saying how he survived, it's time for us to move on. So with that, that's what I'll do. And let's look at the 1992 campaign. It's finally begun. A lot of my colleagues have said, well, we can't wait to get back on the bus. I covered the '84 campaign, Democrats. The '88 campaign, I covered the president, and it's quite a different look covering a campaign from the White House plane as opposed to the bus where the Dems are slugging it out. But I want to draw your attention tonight to the White House element of the campaign. And I'd submit to you that there's not likely to be much straight talk found there either. The example I wanted to read to you was in today's Post, and it was written by the president's lawyer, C. Boyden Gray. And we can hope that this is fresh thinking, straight talk, or total baloney, which is probably right. The headline reads, "On civil rights, we won, they capitulated." Says Boyden Gray, the White House counsel, an all-around bad guy on civil rights. The president's actions weren't due to the Clarence Thomas hearings. They weren't due to David Duke. On the contrary, the Democrats beat a total retreat on quotas. Well, I think that this is just going to be a real primer on what can we look for from the Bush administration in the '92 campaign. Quotas, quotas, quotas. That was going to be their whole mantra for '92. We hate quotas. Well, all of us who sort of followed the law and followed what the court did on the cases that led to the passage of this act know that the Democrats didn't want quotas. It was just the Bush administration saying that that's what this law was about. I mean, Dems are too busy in many cases masquerading as mock Republicans for them to have really wanted to be the quota candidate. And I think what we can see here is just a telegraph message from the Bush administration on whether or not they're still willing to use race as a trump card in the next election, and I think that they certainly will. One other thing Gray said in his piece, Senator Kennedy completely capitulated on quotas. Well, that to me again seems to suggest that the Republicans are willing to pull out their favorite whipping boy and say, well, you know, Kennedy is bad, Kennedy is this, Kennedy is that, and he wanted quotas. Again, totally wrong and not straight talk. The thing that's most troubling about it, though, is that why use that? Why interject race into the campaign? Why? The answer is because it often works. And I think that we can see what's going on in Louisiana right now and see just how that happens. I was talking to a fellow who lobbied the Civil Rights Act just this afternoon. I ran into him in a restaurant and I said, well, you know, can you believe what's going on? Can you believe the David Duke campaign? Can you believe the Bush administration is still dragging out this old horse to beat upon on quotas? And he goes, well, you know, it really is going to make a difficult thing for them, because what if David Duke wins? What are they going to do then? And I think that that's a real interesting question, because on the one hand, the Bush administration was going to use its Civil Rights Act agreement to drag out and say, no, we're not really bad guys. No, we're not Darth Vader on race. But on the other hand, they've got this gentleman from Louisiana who is more than willing and anxious to wrap himself in the mantle of the GOP, and how are they going to handle that? It's a big question mark. Even moderate Republican senators in the Congress don't know what to do. Everyone's saying, oh, it's so scary. What shall we do? Shall we make David Duke a leper and just push him off into, you know, the dark recesses of the convention should he win? It's a question mark. I think, though, it's worth looking at what does he say. I mean, despite the fact that Duke has traded in his Klan's robes for a blow dryer and a powder puff and a lot of plastic surgery, he is just making himself up to be the White House Freddy Krueger for next year. Dick Worthland, Ronald Reagan's pollster during the entire time I covered the White House, just this week released a survey showing some interesting numbers, and let me share them with you. The 41-year-old Louisiana legislator, plastic surgery and all, has gotten so much publicity that he's better known to Americans at large than any of the Democratic presidential candidates. How could that be? I mean, you think, well, Mario Cuomo, he's from New York, surely they know. No, it's David Duke. 58% of those surveyed said they know who David Duke is. 26.7% of those who responded to Worthland surveys said they not only know who he is, they like what he says. You know, I was particularly startled this morning to read also in the Post that so much of Duke's money has come not just from folks in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi, you know, the neighboring states, but from Maryland, from New York, from all over the country. And so I think that even should Mr. Duke lose on Saturday, there's a very real possibility that he'll trot himself back out as a presidential candidate the next time around. But let's look at what is Duke saying, and I understand that he's been here before you, but just a few points so we can draw some parallels. He says, all able-bodied people on welfare should be put to work so they can earn their entitlement checks. Well, in no small part, that's exactly like some of the rhetoric that came out of the Reagan and Bush administration when they cooked up and tried to craft a welfare queen language and workfare rhetoric. David Duke says he favors the death penalty for someone convicted of murder. Well, not only does the President agree with him on this, his Justice Department went to the Supreme Court just last year, and the then Attorney General and recently failed Senate candidate Dick Thornburgh stood up and argued on behalf of introducing victim impact statements at the sentencing phase of a capital trial. Well, that is precisely likely to extend the reach of death penalty for all sorts of crimes in this country. Similarly, Duke says that he's campaigning to reduce the size of the budget among government agencies. You know, cut government, beat it back, it's too big. A2, George Bush, it's again exactly his same message. Now, I'm not a Bush basher. I think in some ways that Bush has some interesting things to say. But if you put the two side by side, it is at least understandable why some of the Democrats are going to likely latch on to this as a key soundbite, if you will, for 92. Perhaps the candidate who's done this most artfully is this city's own Paul Tsongas. In a particularly pointed blast at the White House earlier this month, you had Tsongas describing Duke in this way. Here he pictures the Louisianan is Bush Geppetto to Duke's Pinocchio? I don't know, but I know that marching lockstep right behind Tsongas and drawing this analogy is my home state Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa, Virginia's Doug Wilder, and even the perennial candidate, but who's now this year's wallflower, Jesse Jackson. Duke is a problem. Duke is a problem for Bush. He's a problem for the Republican Party. Now, in some sense, I mean, we've been talking between the three of us about, well, could he win, could he not win? I mean, I have been down in Mississippi also in the past month twice, and many of the politicians I speak with say he's scary. That's what they say. They don't exactly say he'll lose. They think he'll lose, and the only reason they think that is because now the Bush White House, amongst others, are turning up the heat to sort of make an economic issue out of David Duke. I just heard, I was talking to my office in New York before I came over here tonight, and one of my news desk people was saying that the latest estimate by an economist is that Louisiana automatically, with Governor Duke, would lose $1.3 billion. Now, people vote their pocketbooks, but the question is, will they vote the global pocketbook, or will they just think of the sort of mock populist message that Duke is presenting when he comes before them smiling, looking as the telegenic young new voice of Louisiana with the conversion experience he claims to have and the, you know, put aside my wayward ways of the past rhetoric? It's a question mark. And it's a question mark that is haunting George Bush right now. There's another question that's interesting as well that the White House has got to be squirming over. And let's just pose a hypothetical, as did several pro-choice lawyers in Washington last week. Let's pretend a state passed an extremely restrictive abortion law. Let's pretend also that that law included a mandatory 24-hour waiting rule, that it required that doctors give state-drafted lectures to patients who are seeking abortion services. And let's pretend or propose that all parents had to come into a doctor's office and give informed consent before their teenage daughters could seek abortion services. And further in this hypothetical, let's just suppose that case is litigated quickly and moves on a fast track through that miasma we otherwise call as the federal judiciary. And so you're able to petition the Supreme Court on one single question. The question put simply is this: is Roe v. Wade still the law of the land? Well, let's just finally pretend that the Supreme Court of the United States, just as it's wrapping up its work for the 1992 term next June, rules on that question and decides, no, it is not. And as you know, many of you probably know, there are already 4 justices on the court who have made clear, either in their written opinions or in speeches, that they think that Roe v. Wade, the landmark case which legalized abortions in this country, they think that's bad law and that it should be overturned. We don't know precisely where Justice Sandra Day O'Connor stands on it, or where Justice David Souter or the newest Justice Clarence Thomas stands precisely, but we think that the conservative majority marshaled by Chief Justice Rehnquist would be enough there to overturn Roe. So let's just suppose the justices, or as we call them at the court, the Supremes, come into the courtroom and say, strike down Roe. And they do that just at the end of their term, which happens to end June, usually last week of June, maybe first week of July. That time period happens to be just about the same time Democrats and Republicans are going to be rubbing their hands and moving into their national nominating conventions all over the country. Well, so now how precisely would George Bush handle this? Now, on the one hand, we've already got a president who by that time will have to have somehow backpedaled away from his bonehead statement that this is a great time to buy a house. Many of my friends in the recession, many white-collar as well as blue-collar friends, have been laid off. They can't marshal the $20,000, $30,000 you need to make as a down payment. They can't sell the house they're in to buy a new one if they were to buy one. The president has already said what a great time interest rates are down to buy a car. except cars all cost about $20,000. You know, you can find some smaller models, but again, I mean, he will have backpedaled away from all of this talk, and he'll come into his convention, shall we say, under my hypothetical, having to deal with, well, what about this now dead Roe problem? Well, he's talked about the big tent strategy, and that was a theory advanced by the former Republican National Committee Chair Lee Atwater, and his notion was that the Republican Party is one big tent, and it's a imagery that Vice President Quayle has occasionally adopted when they wanted to trot him out and make him sound moderate. It means that women who are pro-choice, as well as women and men and who are not supportive of choice to seek what is still currently legal right to an abortion, could all fit into this one big tent called the Republican Party, and everyone would just like go home hunky-dory, happy, it's all no problem. We just won't face the problem. We'll agree to disagree, but we won't talk about it. Well, I think that won't happen if the court overturns Roe, and that's precisely what these pro-choice lawyers from Planned Parenthood, the National Abortion Rights Action League, and the ACLU hoped last week on November 7th when they filed a petition for certiorari in the United States Supreme Court. While the only part of my little story that's a hypothetical is the degree to which the court will or will not overturn Roe in this coming spring. Everything else is true. The law I was speaking to you about is the Pennsylvania law. It did move quite quickly through the lower federal courts and then was quickly acted upon by the appellate courts. So now we have a dilemma, and it's a dilemma that Bush will have to address. I think he will be lucky, and when I say that, it is not so much because the court wouldn't overturn Roe, but that I think that because Pennsylvania, because of the legal posture in the case, has the right to also file a petition and file its briefs. They can drag their feet, and you don't really have to drag your feet too long. The court doesn't take on new cases for argument much after February or March. So you could just be talking about a few, you know, the holidays are coming up, you know, no one can get the briefs together, they can file it March, and then it's too late. Bush is safe. But I think that what we'll see is a real test for Bush on this issue. And in no small part, it's linked to two other things that I'll tell you about real briefly that don't make him too happy either. And that is, one, the Clarence Thomas hearings. Without going through the whole details of that sordid matter, one thing that emerged after it was a real disgust amongst many women who wondered, why aren't there any women on the Senate Judiciary Committee? How come there are only 2 in the Senate? Now, in fact, 2 of the senators who served on the Senate Judiciary Committee and judged now Justice Thomas faced challenges in the last election from women. Senator Hank Brown of Colorado fought back a challenge from a Boulder City Commissioner, a woman named Josie Heath, who was strong but not quite strong enough to overcome sort of a not super great campaign, but rich and fat campaign by now Senator Brown. And the other person was Senator Paul Simon. He too, in the last time he was up, faced a challenge from a woman candidate. In this case, it was the current Labor Secretary, Lynn Martin. The question that emerged for a lot of women political activists after the Thomas hearing was this, sort of, I'm mad, I'm sick of this, we're not going to take it anymore. We've got to get women in all branches of government. We've got to get women to run. We've got to get women into the Senate. It's interesting because the woman who is now head of the National Women's Political Caucus, Harriet Woods, was the former lieutenant governor of Missouri, and in some year back in the deep recesses of my past, but not 1952, I covered her Senate campaign. She too challenged a man named Kit Bond, who is now senator from Missouri, and lost. She has previously challenged as well Senator Jack Danforth, who's a native of Missouri. She couldn't win. She didn't have the money. It was close, but no cigar. It's interesting because she now is running the National Women's Political Caucus, and she sort of still feels the sting of having come close but not won. What's not clear to me is the degree to which women, if mad, will stay mad through 1992. sort of a dry run was seen in Pennsylvania recently with the Thornburg-Wofford race, which was a real interesting race for me because many of my law school classmates, believe it or not, are involved in Pennsylvania politics. And it was like every day it was saying, you know, Thornburg's got a 44% lead, you know, he'll absolutely go in and smash Wofford. No, Wofford, who no one's ever heard of, is coming back. It's getting close. Well, what we saw there, I think, is an interesting phenomenon, which, as I said, is one that's real troubling to the Bush White House, and that is you had a former son of the state coming back, expecting a coronation, and instead getting an election. Excuse me. That may be, in some sense, what faces George Bush the next time around. It's not so much that women's issues were at the heart of the Pennsylvania race. To the contrary, it was sort of health care. But what you did see was women saying, we haven't forgotten. Women in Philadelphia told Arlen Specter, we haven't forgotten your role in the hearings. Excuse me. Get some water, thanks. You know, I just went to a speech in Washington last week, and the speaker was a woman. She coughed for the last 30 minutes of her speech. Said, oh, I'm sorry, I will sit down because I'm almost finished. But it's on the very slate of issues that was important for Wofford, health care, employment, that women's groups say they're going to mobilize on in 1992. So on that, I'll leave that thought with you, and I'll be happy to take questions on this issue, and leave it to Charlie to come up and wrap up this mess that Jack and I have described. Thanks.
Good evening. How are you? I have a story I tell no matter where I am. I rarely get to tell it in a place I like this much. I'll shorten it so they don't say it in chorus with me. I'd been on Washington Week about 7 years before I got through being entirely scared. And what then ensued was a year or two in which I was quite cocky and thought that somehow I'd become a great thinker just by being on television. I didn't know what it was. And I kind of swelled around and greeted people in airports who didn't know who I was. I got a letter that helped me from a lady in Niagara, New York, who was 78, had this comma 78 after her name, and there was a little scrawl under that, which was her husband, and he was 80-something. And she had written me a fan letter, and it said, I have it memorized. It said, "Dear Mr. McDonald," which is sobering for a celebrity. And then sentence one said, "Sometimes you don't seem to know exactly what the others are talking about on Washington Week in Review." And sentence two was, "Neither do we." And so sentence three was, "Having you there makes us feel better." I had some notes. We didn't really get together on integrating our speeches, so I had some notes on dismal statistics about the United States. And then I had some notes on some issues that we ought to be on the lookout for. And that was about it that I had written down here. Jack took care of the dismal statistics and the call to arms, and then Julie perceptively picked out all the right issues. And I'm just here with some kind of crossed through notes. It's not bad. My statistics I'll just glaze over. The context that I put them in somehow was that here we are in a time, no matter how old we are, Julie thinks that Jack and I are 104. And the flattering thing is she finds us very lively. And I don't know what to do about either thing. But the context that I've kind of gone at this, we in this room turn out to be living in the period of a triumph for freedom and for democracy, and indeed for capitalism, over the greatest threat that those entities have probably endured since they came together in the world. It's an awesome time that we can't possibly appreciate, and our grandchildren will read about the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe, and etc. And it'll be a stunning thing. And so I've always thought we ought to take an inventory. Jack took one, and Ross Perot takes one all the time. If you get a chance, do. I'll go awful fast through. I've crossed out a lot. Remember that this deficit we're prisoner of, we did not accrue over all the years of our history. We quadrupled it in 9 years in the 1980s under a Republican president with a Congress that was most of the time close Democratic. They joined in doing that together. But I do think we should remember that we had a Republican president when we quadrupled our deficit. I've just written down some more. 1 in 4 children is born into poverty today. 1 in 5 lives in poverty. Those figures haven't changed since the 1970s. You'd think they'd have changed a little. Haven't changed at all. We have improved our rating in infant mortality in the world. We now rank, 7 or 8 years ago, we ranked just below Romania. We had emerged out of the third world, and now we were getting up around Romania. Now we've improved it, and we're above Romania, and we're doing a little better. We have not approached any other industrial democracy in terms of what our infant mortality rate is. I added a new one the other day. Gunshots kill more teenage boys in the United States than all natural causes combined. 32 to 37 million people have no health insurance. The decline of educational attainment in this country is staggering, particularly in math and science and in reading. In the television age, reading doesn't hold up very well. I just have one example that I read the other day and wrote down. Less than 30% of Americans 18 to 24, that's 1 out of 3 Americans between 18 and 24, can find Europe on a map. I thought that was... Now, let me get to where I was going to go. This statistic is leading me toward Julie's issues. There's been this to me is the key, will do very well for the key statistic about where we're at, because it begins to explain some things to me. There's been no real increase in median family income in America. No real increase. And we've adjusted it all for inflation, and there's a terrible quarrel about whether it's increased 1% or 2.5%, and it's increased virtually not at all, says the Congressional Budget Office, in conjunction with that man that wrote The Politics of Rich and Poor, who's a conservative, named what, Jack? Kevin Phillips. I'll back Kevin Phillips's statistic, which happens to coincide with the Congressional Budget Office. No real increase in median family income in America since the 1970s, while adding additional wage earners, mainly women, still no gain. That is a remarkable thing to have prevailed so long, as medical care and housing outrace any other inflation numbers and begin to affect your life so much. During this incredible period of no gain for the median income in America, the top 5th of American earners, the top 5th, gained 23%. So they're not much engaged in the other 4/5 not having any gain. The bottom 5th depends on how you count it and what credits you give for welfare and government subsidies, but it was sustained more or less. So really you have this top 5th that had all the gain in the period since the 70s, and the top 1%, if anyone cares, had a 50% gain in income in that period. All right. That's why the middle class was so ready to be apprehensive and scared and frustrated, and if you travel a little in this country, downright angry at government, at politics, at politicians. It's been too long that everyone's been on the edge. And now that we are in a recession, I hope it's not a huge one, it really bites people. It's really severe for people, and it's because of this background. Now, for the coming election, It seems to me that the most useful statistics are none that Jack used or that I used. The most useful statistics are some mentioned by Julie. And that's the statistics of a race in Pennsylvania between a former governor and attorney general of the United States, Dick Thornburgh, who had been a moderate Republican and then kind of threw in with Reagan and then kind of watched Bush, and Bush didn't deviate too much from Reagan suddenly. And Thornburgh got to be kind of a conservative Republican. Whatever he was very well known, and he went home as a conquering hero to run for the Senate against a man named Harris Wofford, who'd been a college president and a Peace Corps guy and an advisor to Martin Luther King, an advisor to Jack Kennedy, an old liberal, just a flat-out old liberal. And a couple of very interesting things happened. First, as Julie mentioned, Thornburgh had a 44-point lead in the polls. And then he had a 40-point lead in the polls, and then he had a 36-point lead in the polls, and a week before it happened, all political insiders said, hell, Thornburgh's beat. We don't understand it. And Thornburgh was beat, and he was beat bad. He was beat 55 to 45, which is a skunking in American politics. And all that happened right there in good old Pennsylvania. And if you sort of look at what that meant, it meant something was happening that caused a remarkable change in these people who have, we now know, been so depressed at the fact that their incomes are on the margins and they can't afford house payments and they can't afford medical care. What in the world was getting said? Well, among other things, Wofford was talking in some language that old liberals don't use. It wasn't sophisticated like Boston. It was, the people of this country are fed up. That's a direct quote, used 400 times. It's time for Americans to take care of Americans. Well, that's a tad embarrassing and for great people that look out for others, but time to look out for Americans. And a whole lot of middle-class people said, darn right. He was also saying things like, someone said something about the corridors of power. Thornburgh talked about he was comfortable in them, and Wofford said it was time to clean up the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. and sound like a term limiter and a troublemaker. What he was really talking about, and he made it very clear, he talked about national health insurance. And he talked about extending unemployment insurance to people who are out of work. And he talked about a tax cut for the middle income group, which is the 3/5 of the population that he was talking to. I think it's fairly important to note that the old liberal did not spend much time on traditional liberal ideology. And I think it's very important to observe that and see that he succeeded when he didn't do that. And he tried to make his appeal to the middle class without a tremendous amount of reference to our traditional liberal issues in America, which will be caught up in whatever happens with a middle class approach, is what most Democrats are agreeing. He didn't talk much about welfare. He didn't talk much about the homeless. He didn't talk much about internationalism. He didn't talk much about any of the traditional ideology, including even civil rights. It spoke for itself in his case, and a lot of these issues speak for themselves. He talked to the middle class about itself and not about little things that trouble it. And there was an awesome response. Now, I was going to make a reference to the Democratic field and get out of the way. There is a Democratic field of people who are only vaguely known compared to David Duke and other great souls. There is one towering Hamlet, Mario Cuomo, the most effective speaker in American politics since Franklin Roosevelt, in my opinion. I knew Franklin Roosevelt, Julie. A remarkable man, an old liberal himself, but an old liberal who's never lost some notions about flags and community and family. And when he talks and it all comes together, he blows away most of the liberals that I've covered in my life. In any case, he's quite capable of adapting to this middle class thing tremendously well. The question, if he comes or if he doesn't, I can't answer. If he comes into it, it will probably remove the possibility that we could have the middle class issues presented by people who look like they were not famous politicians, who were not from the front of magazines, who aren't associated with Washington. And I'm talking about a good many of these candidates that the Democrats have, and I guess I'm mostly talking about Kerry of Nebraska and Bill Clinton of Arkansas. I think Harkin is probably not of the middle class group. He's going to sound like a populist, for better or worse, maybe for better, right here next door in New Hampshire, and we'll see. In any case, I don't know how it's going to come out. What I want to quit on is the thought of the fun it is to have next door in New Hampshire 6 or 8 people running for president that nobody's quite sure who they are. And they will emerge and they will be known. I went there to New Hampshire, first in '64 or sometime with Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller. But one of my most interesting visits was with Mo Udall in 1976. And Udall had learned about television and politics, which we haven't discussed tonight, the trivialization of politics, the obfuscation of politics by this device called television, not by the people running it, by the device. In any case, Udall knew to make a little announcement in Washington, which he hardly even invited the press to: I'm going to run for president of the United States, goodbye. And he had advance men working in Manchester, New Hampshire for some days, picking a block on which he could be photographed on television, walking down the street, greeting the people of New Hampshire, and where to have cameras close so they could be shown, and he would announce for president to the people of New Hampshire. Well, the advance people picked a marvelous block. It's sort of elevated above the street in Manchester. I can see it now, and there's a barber shop right about in the center with a barber pole that turns. And we all got there, press and Mo Udall and everybody, to run against this Jimmy Carter no one had ever heard of but me and Jack Nelson. And it was raining cats and dogs. There was no way to walk down the street. Well, they quickly didn't shake anybody's hand. It quickly was arranged that Mo would go in the barber shop, and the barber, who turned out to be one of the great town characters, everybody said he's funny and he's cheerful and he's probably a Democrat, and we'll just shoot you in there with the barber, and then we'll bring in some other people. And all 3 networks were set up, and the headlights, and the barber was sitting in his own chair reading the paper, and the Boston paper. And Mo was standing over to the side, and someone dabbed a little makeup on him, and then a young woman acting for all 3 networks dropped her arm, and Mo walked across the barber shop and confronted the barber, who stuck out his hand, put his paper down, and shook hands. And Udall said, "I am Congressman Morris Udall of Arizona, and today I am a candidate for president of the United States." And the barber looked up into the lenses of the 3 network television cameras and said, "I know you are. A bunch of us were sitting around laughing about it just this morning." Thank you.